A man who made war on crime falls into a galaxy where crime is the architecture of civilization itself, where the institutions are the predators, and the darkness below the cities is older than anyone's memory of light. In Warhammer 40,000, the guilty do not hide from punishment. They rule. They build the cathedrals. They sign the orders. The skull on his chest has always been a warning. Here, it is the first honest thing anyone has seen in 10,000 years. What does the punishment become when everything is guilty? The war journal was the first thing the arbitrators found. It lay in the center of a scorched crater on sublevel 94 of Hive Velthis Secundus, surrounded by the fused and blackened remains of 3 psychosuppression pylons and the bodies of 11 inquisitorial acolytes who had died before they could understand what the device they were activating actually did. The journal was intact. That was the detail that made Watch Arbiter Crana Pelth pause, because nothing else in that chamber was intact, and the journal had no business being intact, and her hands were shaking slightly as she picked it up and opened it to the first page and read, in a cramped and utterly alien script, words she would spend the rest of her life trying to pass. He had already been gone for 20 minutes by the time she arrived. Frank Castle descended through the arterial passages of sublevel 94 like a blade falling through water. The hive was noise. The hive was always noise, an ocean of it, the grinding of fabricator coils 3 kilometers above, the chant of labor gangs in the rockcrete tunnels, the distant thunder of a void freighter docking at the upper spire. He did not know where he was. He knew the shape of darkness. He knew the weight of a combat knife in his hand and the pressure of a holstered pistol at his hip, and the way his chest tightened when a place was wrong in ways that had not yet made themselves visible. This place was wrong. The air tasted of incense and industrial discharge, and something beneath both of those, something biological and faintly sweet, the way a wound smells when it has been wrapped too long. The people he passed in the tunnel corridors wore grey shifts and bent their heads as though the architecture itself required deference. Their eyes moved correctly, but their faces held a stillness that was not peace. He had seen faces like that before. He had seen them in New York, in the neighborhoods where a certain kind of organization had embedded itself so deeply that its presence had become climate, something accepted the way residents accept the weather, something no longer reported, because reporting it required imagining a world where it could be different. He kept moving. The first man who tried to follow him made it 40 feet before Frank turned around. Not violent, not yet, just turned and looked, and the man stopped, and the stillness in his face cracked briefly into something rawer and more honest, and then he stepped back into a side passage and was gone. Frank noted the direction, filed it. He needed elevation. He needed sight lines. He needed to understand the geometry of whatever he had fallen into before it had a chance to understand him first. He found a maintenance ladder bolted to a ferrocrete wall and climbed it for 2 full minutes, ascending through levels that grew progressively louder and then quieter again, until he emerged into a space that made him stop and look up for longer than he allowed himself to look at anything. The underhive stretched in every direction for what the lizard brain part of him registered as miles. Not streets, not neighborhoods, something older and more geological than either, a sediment of human habitation laid down over centuries until the original architecture was buried entirely and only the accretion remained, rookeries of scavenged metal bolted to the undersides of transit viaducts, shrines burning with fat candles at the mouths of alcoves barely large enough to kneel in, children moving in packs through spaces too narrow for adults, and above it all, always above it all, the impossible inverted mountain of the hive itself, each layer of the upper city pressing down on the layers below with the patient mathematical certainty of weight. He had been in bad places. This was a bad place that had been a bad place for longer than he had been alive, and would be a bad place long after whatever happened to him here was settled. He climbed back down. He had what he needed. The congregation of the unwoven skin found him 40 minutes later in a water reclamation corridor on sublevel 89, which told him they had been tracking him since his arrival and had simply been taking their time deciding what to do with him. There were 11 of them. He clocked this in the first second, along with the fact that 2 of them were moving wrong, too fluid, joints describing arcs slightly outside normal human range, and the fact that the man at the front of the group was wearing a smile that did not belong on a human face because it was not generated by any human impulse he recognized. "Stranger," the man said. Frank said nothing. "The Patriarch has seen you." The man touched his own chest, above the heart, the gesture of a believer handling sacred vocabulary. "The skull, the mark. The Star Children do not send marked men without purpose." Frank looked at them for a long moment. He looked at the two who were moving wrong. He looked at the way the others deferred without looking at the wrong movers directly. The peripheral awareness of people who had learned to live alongside, something they had chosen not to examine too closely. "Take me to him," Frank said. The wrong movers smiled first. He let them lead him for 11 minutes, mapping the route as he went, counting intersections, noting the positions of the sentries they passed without acknowledging, marking the locations of 3 separate improvised barricades that could function as choke points. They brought him to a chamber that had once been a cistern, a vast circular space with a vaulted ceiling 50 feet above, and dry channels cut into the floor where water had once run, and in the center of the chamber, seated on something that had been assembled from the wreckage of a dozen different things, and then elevated on a dais of fused plastic and bone, was the Harvester in Silk. Frank had seen a lot of things. The Harvester in Silk was not a lot of things. It was one thing, and it was very good at being that thing. It was large in the way that a man is large when something has been added to the man, without the man's original framework being removed, so that the result is wrong, in the specific way that addition without subtraction produces wrongness. It had 4 arms. 2 of them were the arms of the man it had once been. 2 of them were something else. Its face retained the architecture of human expression while deploying that architecture in service of something that had never been human. It looked at Frank the way an archivist looks at a significant document. "The skull," it said. Its voice came from somewhere below its throat. "The skull that walks. The skull that hunts." It inclined its head with a gentleness that was the most disturbing thing about it. "We have been waiting for you." "No," Frank said. "You haven't." He had been counting. He had the room geometry. He had the position of every hybrid in the chamber, the angles, the distances, the sight lines. He knew where the exits were. He knew which of the 11 followers had stayed at the entrance and which 4 had come in with him. He had 18 minutes of captivity. That was enough. The knife came out first. Not for the Harvester, not yet. For the nearest hybrid on his left. Because the nearest hybrid on his left had a weapon on its belt, and Frank needed a weapon that made more noise than a knife. The blade went in below the ear. He caught the body with his left arm, stripped the weapon with his right hand, confirmed it was something that functioned like a pistol, fired twice into the hybrid on his right before it could close the distance. The chamber erupted. The Harvester in Silk moved off its dais with a speed that settled the question of whether it was dangerous, covering 15 feet in less time than a man should have been able to cover 3. Frank was already not where he had been. He put 2 rounds into the space where its lower torso had been and used the muzzle flash to clock its new position, and was moving before the echoes finished. He did not fight the Harvester in Silk in that cistern. He fought everything else in the cistern, because everything else died faster, and because killing everything else forced the Harvester in Silk to make choices about what it valued, and making things make choices in emergencies was how you learned what they actually were beneath the presentation. What the Harvester in Silk actually was, Frank learned over the next 4 minutes, was a general. It did not expose itself. It directed. It moved its remaining hybrids in overlapping patterns designed to exhaust and contain, and it was very good at this. And if Frank had been a normal man, he would have been dead inside 90 seconds. He was not a normal man. He was a man who had decided a long time ago that dying was permissible, but quitting was not. And that distinction had taken him to places that should have killed him and had not. And it took him out of the cistern through a drainage channel in the floor, feet first and firing upward, while the Harvester in Silk stood above the opening and looked down at him with something in its 4-armed silhouette that might, on a human, have been respect. He ran, not from fear, from arithmetic. He was alone in an unknown environment with 1 pistol, a combat knife, and 0 ammunition resupply. Running was the correct tactical decision. He made it without hesitation and without shame, because the men who died from pride died stupid, and Frank Castle had enough dead people in his accounting without adding himself to the ledger unnecessarily. He ran for 3 hours. In those 3 hours he moved through 7 sublevels, killed 4 pursuit elements totaling 19 individual hybrids, broke his left hand on a hybrid whose skull was armored in ways a skull had no business being armored, splintered it with a cable tie and a piece of scrap metal, and learned the following things about the hive. It was very large, it was very old, it was under significant stress from a population it could no longer adequately contain, and a significant portion of its lower levels had been quietly colonized by something that wore human faces with imperfect commitment. He found shelter in an abandoned machine chapel, a small room whose original function had been maintenance of some piece of equipment long since cannibalized, and sat with his back to the wall and the pistol on his knee, and thought about what he had seen. He was not on Earth. He had arrived at this conclusion in the first 20 minutes and had been moving on it ever since, the way you move on a confirmed piece of intelligence, integrating it into every subsequent decision without lingering on its implications. He was not on Earth. He was somewhere that was not Earth, and the things in the level below were not human, and the architecture around him was designed for a civilization that operated on a scale he had never personally encountered, and none of that changed the fundamental arithmetic. There were predators here. There were people being preyed upon. The people being preyed upon had not chosen to be preyed upon. He already knew what he was going to do. He found the local system of information flow before dawn, if dawn was a concept that had meaning this deep in the hive. He found it the same way he found every local information network, by listening to how people talked to each other in the hours when they thought no one important was listening. There was a form of Vox transmission in use among the sub-level population, crude and frequently jammed, but functional enough to carry the kind of traffic he needed, which was the traffic of people talking around things they could not say directly, the grammatical gymnastics of populations that had learned to communicate under surveillance. He identified 6 separate community nodes in the upper sub-level region before an arbitrator patrol nearly walked through his position and forced him to relocate. The arbitrators were interesting. Not the organization, not yet, but these specific individuals, 6 of them in carapace armor the deep blue-black of a bruise, moving through the sub-level corridors with the particular gait of people who had been doing this long enough to stop registering their surroundings as threatening and had not yet paid for that lapse. They were not looking at the right things. They were looking at what their training told them to look at, which was not the same as what was actually there, because what was actually there required knowing what to look for, and knowing what to look for required someone having told them, and no one had told them. He could see the infestation they were walking through. They could not. He let them pass. He watched where they came from and where they returned to, and 90 minutes later, he was outside the arbitratorial sub-precinct on level 87, watching the shift changes and counting the entries and exits, and trying to decide whether walking in the front door was more or less efficient than other options. He decided on the front door. He was 2 meters inside before the duty arbiter at the desk reached for the alarm. "Don't," Frank said. She did not. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was a chair designed for someone filling out a complaint form, and placed the stolen hybrid pistol on the desk, gripped toward her, and folded his hands. "I need to talk to someone who makes decisions," he said. "Not threats, not negotiation, information. Take it or don't." The arbitrator looked at the gun, looked at him, looked at the skull on his chest. Her hand moved slowly away from the alarm and toward a communication device, and she said, without taking her eyes off him, "This will take some time." "I have time," Frank said. He did not actually have time, but he had enough. The person who came was not an arbitrator. She arrived 2 hours later, in a ground car with no insignia, wearing a coat that was technically civilian in cut, but was not civilian in the way it hung, and she entered the sub-precinct's interview room, where Frank had been sitting with 2 very nervous arbitrators, and a cup of something that was allegedly recaf, and she looked at him for a long moment before she sat down. "Inquisitor Selvaris Dawn," she said. "Ordo Xenos." She did not offer her hand. You are going to tell me where you came from, how you got here, and what you saw in the sub-levels, in that order, and then I am going to decide what to do with you." Frank told her where he came from. He gave her enough of the truth to be credible, and enough of the operational details of what he had seen to demonstrate that he was a reliable observer, because he needed her to believe the intelligence, not the backstory, and the backstory was the part she would not be able to verify. She listened without interrupting. That was notable. He had briefed a lot of people in his life, military and civilian, official and otherwise, and the ones who did not interrupt were either very good or very dangerous. He suspected Selvaris Dawn was both. "The Congregation of the Unwoven Skin," she said when he finished. "We have had a file on them for 8 years. What you are describing in sub-level 89 is consistent with a Patriarch stage infestation, which means what is in that cistern is not the beginning of the problem. It is the middle." She looked at her hands. "The beginning is approximately 30 years ago, when the cult's first-generation hybrid population began integrating into the hive's labor pool." "How many?" Frank asked. "In the sub-levels below 80. She met his eyes. "Conservative estimate, 400,000. Integrated hybrids, meaning indistinguishable from baseline humans until they choose not to be." Frank thought about 11 million people living on top of 400,000 things wearing human faces. "You're going to burn it," he said. "The sector has already been quarantined," Dawn said. "At some point, the question becomes whether surgical intervention is viable or whether the calculus favors more comprehensive measures." She held his gaze. "I am currently in the surgical intervention phase of that assessment." She offered him a role that was not described as a role but functioned as one. Operational asset, plausible deniability, someone who could move through the sub-levels without the organizational footprint of an inquisitorial retinue. She offered it carefully, in language that gave him exits, because she was good enough to know that people who needed exits were more reliable than people who didn't. He took it, not because he trusted her. He did not trust her. He took it because 400,000 things wearing human faces were living under 11 million people who did not know, and that was his kind of problem, regardless of the organizational structure around it. They worked together for 6 days. In those 6 days, Frank Castle learned the following things about Warhammer 40,000. It was very old. It was very large. It had been at war with itself and everything else for so long that war had become the primary organizing principle of its civilization, rather than a condition that civilization sometimes experienced. Its religious infrastructure was more powerful than its military infrastructure, but they were difficult to distinguish because they had been merged. Its bureaucracy operated on a scale that made American federal agencies look like neighborhood watch programs, and its approach to the collateral damage of conflict was not something he had a clean framework for, because the frameworks he had were calibrated to a civilization that at least publicly maintained a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Selvaris Dawn maintained that distinction in the same way that a very sharp knife maintains a distinction between what it touches and what it does not. Precisely, without sentiment, as a matter of function rather than conviction. He watched her burn a family in sub-level 63. They had been in contact with the cult, hybrid kin markers in 2 of the 4 children. The parents had known and not reported. Dawn made the decision in under a minute, with the calm of someone solving a logistics problem, and afterward she wrote something in a small black journal and moved on. Frank said nothing. He said nothing for 17 blocks, through 3 more hybrid contact points that Dawn's retinue processed with the same surgical precision, and then he stopped walking and said, "Those were children." "Yes," Dawn said, without slowing. 2 of them were. "Yes." She did not look at him. 2 of them would have been vectors. 2 of them would have been raised inside the congregation and brought to first-stage initiation before adolescence. The parents had made a choice about their children's futures that superseded any legal claim to protection under the Lex Imperialis. She turned then, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had explained this before and had stopped finding the explanation difficult. "You are going to have to decide, stranger, whether the standards you bring from wherever you came from are applicable in this environment, or whether you are willing to update them based on the evidence available." "The evidence," Frank said, "is that you just burned children. The evidence, Dawn said, is that in Hive Velthis Secundus over the last 30 years, the gene-stealer cult has consumed approximately 600 lives in direct sacrificial rites, has incorporated an estimated 400,000 individuals into its hybrid population through genetic modification that the individuals themselves were not in most cases able to refuse, and is currently broadcasting a low-frequency warp signal toward a tyrannid tendril that intelligence places at approximately 19 days from orbital insertion range. She held his gaze. The children I made a decision about today were 2 of 400,000 similar decisions that will need to be made before that fleet arrives. I am 19 days from the alternative. Frank looked at her for a long time. What's the alternative? He said. Dawn looked upward, toward the hive ceiling 5 kilometers above, toward the space beyond it. 11 million, she said. Frank had known what the alternative was. He had known it since she said the word quarantine. He had been waiting to hear her say it plainly. So I work the problem, he said. We work the problem, Dawn said, until the calculus changes. He understood her then, not trusted, understood. She was not a monster, which was the more disturbing realization, because he had significant experience with monsters and could categorize them cleanly. She was something harder to categorize, a person who had been doing a monstrous job long enough that the job's logic had become her logic, not because she was weak, but because she was rigorous, because she applied the same unrelenting intelligence to the ethical framework of her work as she applied to its tactical execution, and the framework she had arrived at was one that Frank Castle could not inhabit without cost. He worked the problem. He moved through sublevels that Dawn's retinue could not safely access without alerting the cult's extensive early warning network, using the information architecture he had built in the first 3 hours, sliding through the spaces the cult considered secure. He found 3 of the Patriarch's 7 sub-commanders and removed them in ways that were designed to look like internal discipline rather than external interdiction, buying time and sowing fractures. He located 2 of the broadcasting nodes that fed the warp signal and destroyed them with incendiary charges that he built from materials available in any industrial sublevel, on any hive world, in any universe where desperation and ingenuity shared the same workspace. On the 8th day, he found the Harvester in Silk's secondary congregation point. He found it because the Harvester in Silk let him find it. He understood this in the same moment he understood that the building he was in was no longer structured the way it had been when he entered it, that the walls he had used as reference points had been quietly occupied, that the 11 doors he had identified as exits had all simultaneously acquired presences on the other side. The Harvester in Silk descended from the ceiling. Not metaphorically, literally descended, on a filament of biological material that was not silk despite the name, until it hung 6 feet above the floor with its 4 arms extended and its face arranged in the expression that was the closest approximation it had developed for what human faces did when they intended to communicate genuine communication rather than performance. "You have broken 3 of my fingers," it said. "I do not mean the people who perform functions for me. I mean the literal neural extensions of my own cognitive process, the 3 sub-commanders who carried parts of my distributed intelligence." The 4 arms moved in a gesture that had no human antecedent. "You are remarkable. You are also, I think, not exactly what you appear to be." "I'm exactly what I appear to be," Frank said. "The skull," the Harvester said, "death's heraldry. You came from somewhere that understands death differently than this universe does. This universe has made death administrative. You carry it personally." "I'm not here to talk," Frank said. "I know." The Harvester descended another foot. "You are here to make a decision about whether you can kill me before the congregation collapses the structural supports of this level." The 4 arms each indicated a different load-bearing column, each of which Frank now observed had been discreetly compromised. "The answer is that you probably can. I am very difficult to kill, but you are very committed to the task. However, collapsing this level kills between 4,000 and 6,000 baseline humans in the residential sections of sublevel 71 above us." The face arranged itself again. "You see my arithmetic." Frank saw it. He had been doing the same arithmetic for 8 days, and it was making him tired in a way he had not been tired in a long time, the specific exhaustion of a person who has discovered that the equation he was built to solve does not have a clean solution in this environment. "What do you want?" he said. "To show you something," the harvester said, "not a trap. What I am about to show you is available to anyone willing to look. I want you to look at it before you make your final calculation." It showed him the feeding records. The cult kept records, which was not something he had expected. They kept them in a biological substrate rather than a digital one, encoded in a way that the Inquisition's standard code-breaking systems were not calibrated to read, and what the records showed, over 30 years of activity in Hive Velthis Secundus, was a population that the Hive's official systems showed as existing. 17,000 people who had died in the Hive's administrative records, died in accidents or poverty or crime, died in the anonymous statistical way that people at the bottom of very large hierarchies die, and who were in the cult's records alive, integrated, changed, yes, but alive and documented, and not unaware of what they had become. People who had made a choice, some of them, in the specific circumstances of a hive that had been grinding them toward the statistical category of acceptable loss. "I do not ask you to approve," the harvester said. "I ask you to understand that the thing your inquisitor is going to burn is not only a predator, it is also the only thing in this hive that has been counting the people the hive stopped counting." Frank looked at the records for a long time. "That doesn't change what you are," he said. "No," the harvester agreed, "it doesn't. Or what you're calling down on this planet." The forearms moved. "No." "Then we're done talking," Frank said. The fight in the secondary congregation point lasted 9 minutes and destroyed 4 of the 8 load-bearing columns the harvester in silk had indicated, which caused a partial collapse of sub-level 71 that killed not 4,000 to 6,000, but 212 people, because Frank had used the 16 seconds of distraction generated by the first column's destruction to get a Vox message to Dawn's retinue with evacuation coordinates, and the evacuation had been less than complete, but more than 0. He could not kill the harvester in silk in 9 minutes. He had known this going in. What he could do in 9 minutes was damage it severely enough that its distributed cognition was interrupted, its neural subcommanders disrupted, its ability to coordinate the congregation's 400,000 elements reduced from systemic to local, which was what Dawn needed to run the surgical phase, and he did this at the cost of 3 broken ribs and a deep laceration across his left shoulder from one of the harvester's non-human arms, and he made it out through a drainage corridor for the second time in 8 days, which he found bleakly appropriate. Dawn ran the surgical phase over the next 11 days. Frank was part of it. He was the part of it that went into spaces where Dawn's retinue would have been recognized and executed before they covered 10 meters, and he was the part of it that, on the 6th day of the surgical phase, stood in a processing center on sub-level 44 and looked at the records the cult had kept, and understood that the harvester in silk had been right about one thing, and that being right about one thing while being a xenoform predator conducting an infestation of an 11 million person population was not a moral complication that resolved cleanly in either direction, and that this was the kind of problem this universe produced with a regularity that his previous universe did not. He filed it. He kept moving. On the 15th day, 7 days ahead of the Inquisitor's fleet arrival deadline, the beacon went silent. Not because Frank destroyed it, because the harvester in silk destroyed it. He received the message through a dead drop they had established in the drainage network, encoded in a way that took him 40 minutes to decode, and when he decoded it, the message said the following. The Tyrannid fleet had been detected by the Patriarch's scrying, and the Patriarch had determined that its arrival would result in the absorption of the congregation's hybrid population into the fleet's biomass before the Star Children's promise could be fulfilled, and the Patriarch had acted on its own survival interest in a way that aligned, purely coincidentally, with his and Dawn's. It also said, "I know what your Inquisitor is going to do now that the strategic calculus permits it. I know what she told you the alternative was. I want you to understand that I am telling you this not to appeal to your mercy, because I know you do not have mercy in the form I would need, but because you should know that the thing she is about to do, and the thing I did, are the same kind of thing." Dawn called him to the command post on level 82 that same hour. "The beacon is down," she said. "I know," Frank said. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face held the specific stillness of a decision that had already been made. "The surgical phase achieved approximately 43% elimination of the identified hybrid population," she said. "That leaves an estimated 230,000 integrated cult members in the sub-level network, dispersed and without centralized command, but extant and capable of reconstitution, given sufficient time." She folded her hands. "The strategic calculus has changed. The Tyranid tendril will not arrive. The immediate threat is contained." She paused. "I am recommending a Tier 2 response." Frank said nothing. "Tier 2, she said, and something in her voice changed. Not softened, but changed. "Is not orbital bombardment. Tier 2 is a systematic level-by-level clearance operation that will take approximately 7 months and will require the complete evacuation of the sub-levels below 40, which is a logistically achievable but extremely costly operation that will displace approximately 3 million people and require resources from the planetary governor's office that he has not yet committed." She met his eyes. "I am recommending this over Tier 3. "Tier 3 is the 11 million, Frank said. "Tier 3 is the 11 million, Dawn confirmed. He had not expected that. He had expected Selvaris Dawn to be the ending. He had spent 15 days building a model of her in his head as the thing this universe produced in the role of the system that needed to be stopped, the inquisitor who would choose the simple solution when the simple solution killed everyone, the institutional logic made human. He had been wrong in the specific way that he was sometimes wrong about people when he had categorized them early and then accumulated evidence against the category without updating. She was not the ending. She was something considerably harder to process. "Why?" he said. "Because the cost of Tier 3 is 11 million people," she said, "which I am authorized to spend, which I could spend and none of my superiors would fault me for spending, but I have not spent it yet, and the calculus has changed, and I would like to see whether the calculus permits me not to spend it." She held his gaze, not out of sentimentality. "Because I am authorized to spend it does not mean I am required to spend it, and I was given authority over this operation because the Ordo trusts my judgment, and my judgment says Tier 2 is viable." Frank looked at her for a long time. "I'll work the clearance," he said. "I know," Dawn said. They began the evacuation of the sub-levels below 40 that evening. The 7 months of the clearance operation were the longest 7 months Frank Castle had experienced in a life that had contained significant competition for that title, not because of the physical cost, which was substantial, or because of the operational complexity, which was greater, but because of what he learned in the course of it. He learned what the people in the sub-levels below 40 had been living in. He learned what the congregation had meant to some of them, and what it had done to others, and how those two things were not always in separate populations. He learned the difference between the hybrids who had been born to it, and the hybrids who had chosen it, and the hybrids who had not been given the question, and he learned that the Inquisition's systematic clearance did not make that distinction, because the Inquisition did not have the operational capacity to make it at scale. He made it, where he could. On a case-by-case basis, in the spaces between the clearance teams, in the moments when his own judgment was the only authority present. Dawn knew. He was certain of this. She said nothing. He concluded this meant either that she was choosing not to see, or that she had decided that his judgment in those spaces was within the operational margin she was willing to accept, and he did not know which it was, and chose not to ask, because the answer might be one he could not work with. The harvester in silk died on the 209th day of the clearance operation, in sub-level 9, the deepest functional level of the hive, in a space that was half cistern and half something the congregation had built over 30 years that had no word in the imperial lexicon for what it was. A cathedral of memory and biology and the accumulated faith of 400,000 people who had been told by something not entirely human that they were counted. It died facing him. It could have fled. He knew this. It had options remaining and it did not use them, and he spent a significant amount of time afterward considering whether that was strategic, the cornered animal's stillness, or something else. and he arrived at no conclusion he was comfortable with, and he filed it with the other things in this universe that had not resolved. "The skull," the harvester said, and it was the last thing it said, and its voice at the end was very tired, the voice of something that had been very large for a very long time, and had used the largeness up. Frank said nothing. He stood in that space for 3 minutes after. That was as long as he permitted himself. The clearance operation concluded on the 231st day. The Inquisition's assessment listed the hive Velthis secundus gene-stealer infestation as resolved. The sublevels were resettled over the subsequent 4 years, and the arbitratorial presence in the lower hive was increased, and the Vox surveillance network was upgraded, and in the official records of the Ordo Xenos, the file was closed with a notation that read, "Successful surgical intervention, Tier 2 protocol, primary operative recovered, all strategic assets decommissioned." Selvaris Dawn brought him the report in person. They sat in the command post that had been their operational headquarters for 7 months, which by that point felt less like a command post and more like the specific kind of space that long shared work creates, a space that holds the residue of decision-making in the way certain rooms hold the residue of prayer. "The Ordo has a standing offer for operational assets of your demonstrated capability," Dawn said. "It would not be comfort, it would not be clemency, it would be work." Frank looked at the report. He looked at the notation. He looked at the phrase, "all strategic assets decommissioned," and understood that he was in that category, and that Dawn was telling him he was not, and that the distance between those two things was the offer. "Is there more of it?" he said. "The infestation, elsewhere." Dawn looked at him. "It is the 41st millennium," she said. "There is always more of it." He took the offer, not because he had found a home, not because he had found a system he could trust. He took it because there were things in the dark in this universe, and the people in the light did not always know they were there, and someone needed to go into the dark and make the things afraid, and he was very good at that, and this universe had more dark in it than he had ever encountered, and it had more things in the dark, and the equation, for Frank Castle, was therefore very simple. He was the punishment. This universe had a great deal left to punish. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war, and somewhere in the sub-levels of 1,000 hive worlds, in the crawl spaces between the things the Imperium could see and the things it could not, a skull, marked in black, walked the line between them, and the things in the dark had learned, one by one, in the specific and permanent way that things learn the lessons they cannot survive, that the skull meant the war had already arrived.